February 25th, 2022, Elden Ring was released. Before it even released, there was all kinds of speculation to this and that. Upon its release, there was still insane levels of speculations of this and that. There was all kinds of things we wondered about as we went through the entire game. We wondered who the Newmen were. We wondered who the Newmen were with Queen Marika, who the Gloamite Queen was. We wondered about the people of the night, the Black Knives, the Knights Cavalry. We wondered about what the two fingers are. We wondered about the trees, more specifically the Erd tree. We wondered what the crucible was in the Great Tree. We wondered about the Snowy Crone. And we wondered about the Royal Revenant. There are plenty of full amount of things we can be sure of, such as the family lineage of the main base game family. We know Radagon is somehow Marika. We know children of Radagon, Radon, Rani, and Rykard. They are also Marika's children. We know Moog and Morgott are twins and omens. We know their differences in ideas. We know of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. We know before him was another kind of Elden Lord, an ancient one not mentioned in Landell's history, of Placidusax. We know he once had the Elden Ring, and his god fled him. We know the Erd Tree officials. They run basically tight security, sort of like the CIA or something, for the Erd Tree in the Elden Ring world universe. They work for Landell. They protect the interests of the Erd Tree and its faith to the Golden Order. We know they are part of the Volcano Manor also. We find their paintings and tools and all that there that we can't find in the Shaded Castle. But more than just that, we find ever so subtle details that we can't explain for any which reason, such as why the Gravekeepers set, who were duelists, mind you, were seen to bear the resemblance of some form of traitor. There was all kinds of subtle details of the sort in plain sight, but in no way, shape, or form could we have imagined how it actually fit into anything. We had completely nothing to go off of in the Elden Ring community. Not one person had the right guess as to what was actually the case. There was lots of crazy theories, but I haven't seen any right ones that from that time period. And I myself had my own theories in the mix. I thought maybe it had to do with Godwyn the Golden. We had nothing to really go off of what he was in personality. We knew Lanciax flew to the south of the Volcano Manor at the foot of Mount Gelmir. Could have been related. Could have not, maybe. But all we had was open-ended theories all over. And then we had a more exciting mention that happened a fair while ago. The mention of a DLC. The Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC. We had the simple picture. The picture of what appeared to be Miquella riding Torrent in the Grave Plain fields of the DLC. Or sorry, Gravesite Plains of the DLC. We had zero idea what that really meant. We seen the spectral graves, which were absolutely ancient, as we do know now. But we had absolutely zero idea as to where Miquella came in any of this. But let's talk about the first trailer. Or sorry, the story trailer. This is the one that actually is supposed to paint the most perspectives of our lore understanding in some way, shape, or form. Let's kind of just pick apart what we already recognize. This we do not recognize. Whatever this cloth is, this fabric material, we have zero idea what that is. It's not yellow, so it's not Hornsent related necessarily.
The seduction.
But we know where this setting is. And this is in fact some kind of stitching.
And the betrayal.
And this is in fact Marika. Queen Marika.
An affair from which gold arose.
And at the Divine Gate, seizing what seems to be order. Some people may speculate that this is also in ways possibly Radagon, as we do not have a timeline as to when he was truly of relevance to the Elden Ring lore. But something of note is how extra fleshy this depiction of the Divine Tower is compared to when we see it in game. When we see it in game, it's more ashen, almost like ages long past and it's completely dried out. What all that could possibly mean is very uncertain.
An affair from which gold arose.
But there are theories around that are pretty good. Now, you can't see it too well in this depiction,
And so too was
but in game you would see that vast majority of these bodies definitely have horns on them, suggesting they are of Hornsent.
shadow born. What followed was a war unseen.
And now we have the Crusade of Messmer. Messmer and his lot, attacking what appears to be some kind of Hornsent settlement.
One that could never be put to song.
Here we have what appears to be a great horned warrior, absolutely slaughtered with spears. Possibly arrows of Black Knight. At least that's how it seems to me. We have this higher up perspective of Messmer looking over and downward at this civilization being trampled, burned, attacked, slaughtered, but primarily burned. We also see water, skyline, and some kind of very distant structure that is vastly too far for us to possibly see and understand. We see the fire coils snaking through the sky, the furnace golems trampling and incinerating both body and soul. It was a horrible event that we know, in fact, the Hornsent were in victim of.
Grace or honor. The tyranny of Messmer.
We have Romina, the Saint of the Bud. This is the bud itself, this polearm. The fact that it is in fact some kind of bud and a spear at the same time, and that she sort of developed with scarlet rot with it in some kind of crazy mutation form, could suggest that this weapon was not just some kind of sacred item, but a relic of sorts to a previous time of scarlet rot and its primal glory, as it were. A sort of glory we can't really know too much about.
Flame.
The dancing lion, or at least a dancing lion sculpted keepers. I myself, like many, thought that golden eye of Messmer's was either a very genuine golden eye, or perhaps the golden eye of serpent or dragon. We were very wrong. But here we see why Messmer is indeed called the Impaler. He impales and incinerates, but he keeps the impaled bodies for decoration. But this part, to me, after playing the DLC, was the most massively peculiar detail we could have been given. It is of a place that we don't quite recognize. Now, some of you are already jumping to conclusions. What are you talking about? This must be Bellarat. Bellarat doesn't look like that. And nowhere in Bellarat does it look like this, specifically. There's something similar in Bellarat, but to say it looks like this would mean the tower was already well sealed. But not only that, you would also be suggesting Bellarat was much closer to the tree. Like, within arm's reach, practically. But besides that, there is another series of complications here. The first being is that we don't see any of the great tower structures that are physical supports leading all the way down and reaching all the way up. And we don't see any of the extra pillars, nor exactly where the divine gate might be. So it is quite a few complications, and trying to actually suggest it is in fact Belurat. Because the part of Belurat that gets obscured is just the upper portion. The massively upper portion that keeps the divine gate. The rest of it is actually well showing, but it is physically inaccessible. And if you compare them side by side, like looking at this to head on early game Belurat that we come across, by no angle does it actually look like this. But there is another topic of that I've noticed, and I did kind of look into this one. The perspective topic of where Messmer would have been doing this. And you can actually see what looks like a tower being incinerated with its many pillaring structures or details. But what's curious, especially, is the side that Messmer's forces are coming from, and where Messmer is in all this. From this exact position and nature of Hornsent cultural structure settlements, this is just Messmer wiping out the rest, basically, because this is supposed to be an entrance area. Like, factually, if you look at current Belurat, the only structure like this is the entrance way in shape and nature, and then the rest look more like that, sort of, but not in this arrangement. And the closest we see in game to this angle perspective is right outside the Sculpted Keeper's fight, or higher up even in Belurat, by the actual entry region of the Divine Tower. But the Divine Tower itself would be massively too high up to get this exact perspective. If we were looking from the Divine Tower, we'd be looking down into these things as opposed to seeing their legs and whatever. Not too much. So there is numerous complications in suggesting it is in fact Belurat, especially since I remember Belurat wasn't so big enough that it can fit multiple of these things too well. And on that side, it would have been a huge dip down, and it would have had what was basically a poison swamp now. And this ain't the right kind of tower right here. In fact, it would also, this tower here, for if we're suggesting it is Belurat, should be right there, should be thicker, should be going up, and there should be another tower in adjacency to it. Now, kind of show that in game in a little bit here, but just to kind of further my understanding and expressing it of the topic. It's kind of, I forget if they showed it in this video. We see, instead of Bellerat being closer to the tree, we see what is basically Messmer's structure up close to the tree. And we see very much so that Bellerat is right here in this very distant location in this same trailer. Now, so if there's any like sort of defense that it is in fact Bellerat, like there's no reason to suspect it is. Like Hornsent, yes. Hornsent settlement, yes. Bellerat, no. Like the designs are very Hornsent, but all depictions of it are vastly different from Bellerat's. Like they're not rebuilding Bellerat's, they're all burned away dead. Like, who's rebuilding this? Burned away and they sealed the tower. Bellerat's just a different place. In fact, in the other trailer, we very much see that the entire several months, like multiple months in advance, this is exactly what I was talking about, mind you, about this is not Bellerat. That looks absolutely nothing like it. They didn't change things from this to the other story trailer at all. So they literally put together a whole nother thing for it. And they did something a little bit similar with the base game's trailer, as I recall, when it comes to Landell, for like the story trailer. There was like entire like towers in that in places that are no longer there. But the funny thing about said tower was that one was that the tower that I specifically recall that was no longer there was at the end of the way to Mikola's Divine Tower, where we have a golem just like knocked down at a broken like bridging there, and instead we have a sending gate at the end of the broken whatever, and it takes us straight to the Divine Tower for Mikola and Millennia. And that has to do with Godric's assault on Landell, mind you. So, if you're wondering why Godric has some kind of access to essentially that specific bridge, and in turn probably that Divine Tower, and maybe was daring enough to challenge Millennia to a battle, that's why. It was just perfectly convenient for him. But I digress. There isn't too much else to really pick at with this trailer specifically. Like, these are the lampreys, these are their gills. They're just kind of mean. This is that Inquisitor, or High Inquisitor encounter. This is one of those, this is actually Bellerat. This is just straight down the street of it. Up there's usually those, sniper ones. Yeah, I've definitely been through a lot of this enough to know exactly where it is. At first I was looking at this and thinking to myself, this has to be like a ruins, right? Then I'm realizing with some of these taller structures, nope, this is just Bellerat. There is nowhere else like this. Now, some of this is definitely a lot more different than many people expected. Like, we didn't fight her like this out in this open area. We had no reason to expect this was some kind of important figure boss, but I don't think too many people realized how close they were to the tree in this depiction. Now these ones don't actually do that in the open field. The Putrescent Knight, there wasn't much to take in with that, but the details were absolutely insane. I remember suspecting that his body was like the rib cage of that horse. And I think that's still semi-correct. Like if you compare the anatomy to a horse's skeletal anatomy, it actually lines up really well. Midra, his conditions was actually unrelated to that of the rest of what we're gonna talk about here. His is actually just a very secluded sort of story. But we're gonna go into a lot of fun little topics here to do with Messmer here. But before I get too scatterbrained about anything else, since I'm really running out of topics to do with these trailers, especially this not so included one. I think this is more of an angle shot thing to do with Mikola in the Radon fight. I'm sure if we could physically pause the screen and angle it correctly, we could probably get this exact sort of depiction at a certain time of day from the boss room. At least that's my suspicions. Otherwise, the fact that he's sitting on a throne for a demigod is no mystery. Messmer was the son of Marika. Let's get to some of the more interesting topics. So, first of all, this released, and we came to realize that Messmer was somehow the image of a traitor in which the Gravekeepers were based on. But not only that, that he had essentially the previous main ownership of the Volcano Manor. And quite possibly he had much to do with some of the war in the mountaintops of the giants. Like, if you pay attention also, especially with not just the fact that he does the impaling thing, but the fact that it was against the giants who wielded fire. Of course their method had to be a little bit different than countering with fire, perhaps. But there is more to that story and topic that I'm not actually going to go about in video. But what I was about to go on about was what I wanted to talk about was about the troops. So the soldiers that we see pretty much this part. In game, they use more so Godfrey era sort of combat. Like, they use stomp attacks, which is a very Godfrey thing, and would suggest they're from a time of his relevance. where it was a more common thing to keep in match with larger foes. They would go in berserk, sort of like the idea of Godfrey and his Tarnished would, in some ways. That Godfrey himself had a lust for battle. It's not fully understood if these people were in fact tarnished, per se. And I'll go a bit more into that a little later. I'm trying to keep this video a little more neat and concise, so bear with me a little. But besides that, the DLC otherwise stays perfectly secluded to itself, away from the main game. There was completely zero hints that anything related to the DLC even existed. We had completely nothing to go off of. It was such a huge mystery that once any amount of anything came out, it was just the hugest whatever people threw out and tried to speculate off of. It was completely crazy. Some of it was pretty likely sounding, some of it was a little extra crazy sounding, just like, are you sure about that? And some of it was like metaphysical, and it's just like, okay, I'm starting to lose my understanding. What? It was honestly a fun little period there. A fun period of playing, well, how well is this gonna age? But let's look at this a little more inside the game for once. And surely enough, quite a few familiar looking sights for sure, but quite a few different ones also. Without a doubt, this place was pretty terrorized. But in terms of actual burning damage, I want to say it's a little bit more minimalistic to some degree. Like, it was 100% attacked, but let's take another area of perspective if we can. Yeah, as you can see, there is towers that reach all the way to the freaking sky. Is one of the main things I want to point out here when it comes to Ballarat. Is to suggest certain things or just obscured, you still have to keep in mind there's these massive skyscraper-esque towers that exist here. It's so tall that I physically cannot look up and see it. And it doesn't loom quite as near and dear to the Shaju tree. Like, I can change my perspective. That is a very distant looking tree. Like, if you're paying attention to the trailer, it is like a quarter in size comparison at least. So it's quite a very different thing. But one of the things I was especially noticing in the trailer was that there was like the appearance of like more land masses in like the shots that they were using. Otherwise, that underside is something insane to take in. And the order of operations was that they were betrayed, burned, and then the tower itself was sealed. But otherwise, we do see like the shadowy remnant stuff, like dropping down from the tree over at the Shadow Keep itself. And I'll show you. Just in Shadu Altus itself is already a much more convincing sight, as you see these draping down from the sky, from the tree itself. Sort of like in the lands between, you'd see the golden rays shine down from the tree all across the lands between. And then in the Moonlight Altar plateau, you would see a blue streams seeping down from like the moonlight's glow and the stars or whatever. Really cool. We're never actually told exactly what those are. Like coming down from the sky, but it's convincing that it's no less than like the essence of the tree itself, just sort of naturally draping and covering the terrain as part of its giving back to it, almost like it corrodes and also grows or something. Hard to really say. But something you can definitely already notice at its very own technical presence up close is that the Shadow Keep itself has more multiple visible and notable landmass behaviors to it. And I especially wouldn't dare say that the Shadow Keep was built like a long time ago. I want to say they definitely incorporated some stuff. Now, I especially like where that mentality came from with Hawkshaw's videos on is trying to explain the thing in the back, that goofy nameless tower thing with the chalice and whatnot. And I have kind of a theory to that, but I don't know if I want to like really say much on that. I think it's probably more of like a saying of hey, we have sap here or whatever, because in the actual lands between itself, they physically ran out of sap from the Erd Tree, and that marked the end of what is known as the Age of Plenty. So that actually is one part of the theory of the list of theories I have working for why they might have actually invaded the Land of Shadows. But there is a little bit more going on here than just that, and this is not the right video for that discussion. But now some of you are probably wondering, so what makes this really qualify for that of the actual settlement in question? For starters, up close, we are literally beneath the branches of the tree. And this is, in fact, the Shadow Keep, which also has some interesting signs of wreckage and ruin in varying places for questionable reasons of detail. To me personally, the greatest wreckage and ruin is the fact that it has two races right next to each other, but I don't think that's important. Or at least that should be the real wreckage and ruin in question, in my opinion. Because, like, why? But the actual wreckage and ruin we're going to particularly go into question of detail on is actually over here. To me, this was actually a little interesting. And this might actually go into a fun lot of speculation and conversations for some time to come. And it is actually to do with all the wreckage and ruin to do with these things. Now, yes, this is just one right here. There's also bits of wreckage and ruin of like 2 or 3 more up here. But there's even more than that still. Down below from here, there is ruins of Hornsent culture settlement structure, and down there is a graveyard of Furnace Golems. And I cannot stress that enough. It is a genuine graveyard of Furnace Golems. One of them was even like unconscious, and we pretty much reignited its engine. They're pretty much siege engines, to mind you. Really weird golem sorts, but they are in fact considered siege engines to the design of Elden Ring, which is why explosives are frowned upon by them. But another was just waiting for something in its proximity to convince it to do anything. Which is all very interesting. And these guys happen to have trashed these golems by chance by being very particularly reckless, which is why they have a rare chance to sometimes drop the Furnace Golem Visages, which I think is an absolute neat detail. And we also get a key item note discussing that factor. I'm trying to think which one it is. This one. Keep fire pots well clear when the golem's furnace is ablaze. And never let me catch you with pots that produce flaming whirlwinds, for goodness sake. So there was a genuine list of issues that have happened around these things. In which case, some of these soldiers did all kinds of knuckleheaded stuff, like actually breaking them and then making furnace pots. But let's move on. Now, I myself personally lean towards the idea that the perspective in which we've had of Messmer's assault on a settlement of the Hornsent is actually of this kind of angle, facing west. Where I'm at currently is the Shaman Village, which is in the hinterlands portion. which is especially secluded off by Messmer himself. It's not quite stated, but it is quite obvious. But the part I want to focus on of the attack of the settlement is what angle is it coming from? The fact that we don't see the Shadu tree in the depiction would suggest that it is not an angle of north, which in fact would mean the angle has to be either west, south, or east. And the likelihood of it to be east is very unlikely, because that would suggest it would have to capture like some of this rock cliffing as well as that one, and there isn't much else to really look at besides those. And so in which case it would have to be more likely either west or south, and angling it towards the south would mean you're more likely probably going to catch a single towering structure in the distance of your shot, which would be what is considered the center of the lands between. That tower there, which unlike that, in the far distance of the shot of Messmer looking over, or sort of like looming over the site of the settlement burning, we see something more distant that would be like on the left side. I might throw a picture here on the screen here for you, but it's looked more like 3 tower or like structures in the distance as opposed to 1, in which case I don't think it's the same kind of thing at all. And since there's nothing else to this towards the south that really towers over anything, that would just mean we have the west. Now, from this angle, we're not quite seeing much of anything. We have this very towering shadow keep blocking every single ounce of our view. And then over that way, we have what is the Divine Tower, and of course we can see the Divine Gate on top, and some of the extra pillars that we otherwise can't make out too well when it's like obscured or whatever. But I'm going to also include like a before sort of shot, if you would, at a certain spot here, probably about here. Yes. Hopefully I remember to edit this. Alrighty. This actually almost looks like a more adequate perspective entirely. In fact, if we look to our right, like if we were angled about this much, we don't see the tree. If we were looking downward, would it be even better? But it'd have to be like much closer in that way. However, if you look carefully on the left there, in the far distance, we do see like multiple towering like structures in the far distance. And that is actually an important detail I want to stress, and what I believe is a main part of the perspective. That I do think it is indeed facing west, and that is in the far distance, just barely visible, in which case just beyond that to the very north of it is in fact just water presentation and skyline. And of course, being actually up in there, we'd get a better angle towards all that, where it would look a little more adequate. So yes, I do believe it is indeed within that general parameter that the settlement is being physically burned violently. And that would also better fit in another topic. Why is the invasion coming from the angle of north and not from the what's essentially the front door of it? The front door of the settlement. Like, people aren't barging through the front and taking over. They're coming from the back door. So, what is at the back door? Well, at a first glance, it might seem like there isn't much actually of notes at what's essentially the north end of things, or as I'm going to call the back door. However, it is very clear that it doesn't take too many footsteps for it to be a very different environment. Like, over there has definitely seen something very different from over here. Now, over here is the hinterlands, which has the Shaman Village and whatnot. But not just that, they also have an absurd amount of beautiful flowers and this absolutely insane crater. Now, I personally believe the crater could mean all kinds of things. Now, whether or not it's just strictly a natural formed crater is very debatable. But one little detail I noticed is actually it's two details. One, it is a bottomless crater, and secondly, it actually runs through the tree worship passage, which goes to the Shaju tree base, where we would fight the Avatar normally. Now, this could mean that this is actually pretty important to the ways of the travel of how they got here initially, in which case they somehow came through this general vicinity. Maybe the golems came out of this and the people came through down there. Some kind of goofy rendezvous and infiltration, and it was just what was old is gone, what's new is here now. And let me be clear about something. The structure of the Shadow Keep here is very much new. This is one of those topics I would say is not very debatable. It's one of those situations I would say is so scarcely seen in like all of Elden Ring that it's almost freaky. Like, it looks like someone spent a couple $1 billion polishing this place, if we're comparing it to like a modern era. But nothing is out of place in this portion. It is just wonderful. It feels like I'm insulting the floor by walking on it. And that is actually quite an accomplishment, I would say. It's like it's so clean, you could eat your food off of it and then lick the floor. And there is actual topic that Messmer and his men have taken things that belong to Hornsent's culture and their information of the archives and specimens, and the lower down of his men have especially insisted on their preservation of such things. When we immediately come up here it's a very different type of story of how nice and neat it is, and neatly attached it is to why is this sketchy looking planked mass here, and why don't we go through this door? Well, they don't actually want anyone going through this door. They consider that a hazard because, one, they don't want anyone down there, and two, they have their own list of troubles. But those are topics a little too soon for us to better talk about. So now we have an idea, however, and enough of the necessary proof that Messmer and his men could have definitely came from this side and amounted to any amount of the way things are and have become. Let's now talk about something just as important and where it all starts setting things a little further in. Let's talk about Messmer's commanders of his forces. The first I would like to talk about is the Tree Sentinel. I mean Commander Gaius, who was in charge of actually leading Messmer's forces directly into battle. Now, you probably don't actually remember seeing him in the story trailer at all. That's perfectly fine, and it makes perfect sense why we might not have. He might have been too far in advance to actually see him any further. In theory, he would have led the march and gone to where needed to further rout and conquer. But he is not just any sort of commander force of nature. He, unlike most individuals we meet following that of the Golden Order, sports gravity. He is not just any sorcerer, though. No. He's actually, in ways, a sort of older brother sort of figure to Rellana, as they have both trained in gravity arts by the same Alabaster Lord. Gaius himself, however, wasn't simply human, he was actually Albinoric, which, they made him leg armor and he couldn't actually use it. But his boss room is a bit of an interesting one, and for very good reason. In his boss arena, we find it absolutely littered with typical weapons to that and the belonging of those of the Erd Tree. The Erd Tree's faithful. But more than that, we find the most of those damaged and slain here, just their armor and whatever left in the battlefield, to be in the belonging of the Banished Knights. Knights who were, as far as we knew, had become some ways lordless. We still don't know the full nature to this, but we know that their arts are particularly old, and all the Banished Knights themselves were quite accomplished. So the fact that there's just a field of them littered here is a little unusual, especially with a little sign of anything else that was here. Although, albeit there is stuff like the Gravekeeper axe here. There is some of the great swords that were in specialized creation by that of EG. In which case we can kind of trust certain relations of the development of this and the kind of timeline in which this all took place. Yeah, you can also see arrows littering the floor. The list goes on. But the fact that it is of the Banished Knights and the shields of what is the exiled soldiers is very interesting. And this leaves a lot of questions to be asked. But one of the other interesting details of Commander Gaius is that his the music of his boss theme is actually just a reuse of that of Commander Niall. Or Commander O'Neill even. Which is an interesting factor because, well, Commander Niall and O'Neill, their sets are practically based around that of none other than the Banished Knights, which could have some implication of a timeline as to when they were of certain relevance. In which case, once they had no more knights, these were essentially free soldiers for whatever. Or whoever would actually take them in. But what's suspicious here, though, is that there's only one area in all of this that has this sort of cemetery of armaments and armor of the Banished Knights. And it's strictly Commander Gaius's boss room. One thing that should come to mind, perhaps, is that maybe it was some kind of bitter betrayal. As for why, I do believe it is too soon to really go off on that. But I do believe this could be all more of a later event sort of topic. But we still got a lot to talk about. But now we're going to talk about Millennia, Blade of Mickle, Rellana, Blade of Messmer, who was the youngest Carian princess and sibling to Rellana, Queen of the Full Moon, Queen of Rea Lucaria. Now, the thing about Rellana is that she is the most useful sort of living timeline in all of this. Same with Gaius, actually. But Rellana, her being the youngest sister to Rellana, means there was only a certain time period in which that she could have been in this right condition of how they've interacted historically. But essentially, she gave up her sort of like lineage rights as a Carian princess to go and do this crusade with Messmer. And not only that, but we know for a fact that she has a lock of Renalla's own hair as part of her blessing from her own sister in going on this bitter crusade. And true for word, as a Blade of Messmer, we have one sword that is hers of Carian nature, and one sword that is Messmer's and his flame of the Abyssal Serpent. due to her lineage and position in all this, this would mean that her coinciding to go on this partaking would have to be in relations to when the Golden Order and when the moon and the sun were basically conjoined, as Muriel would word it. And this is to do with when Radagon and Rellana were married. And so this put a lot of sort of good nature between the two of the Erdtree and Rhea Lucaria. But we know this couldn't have been after the Shattering because Rellana was still in her right state of mind, which would also mean that Radagon hadn't divorced her yet. So the time in which they have personally gone and essentially gone on their crusade, Radahn was born. Ranni was also perhaps born. Obviously Rykard would have been born. But overall, it was before the Shattering. It was before Miquella and Malenia were born. Miquella would earn certain influence within that of the Carian land, but in terms of Carian folk who would dare actually explore too far with him would be no other than those of Haima Conspectus, who were quite brave and otherwise practical warriors, but also judge-like. But that has nothing to do with this. However, Rellana herself, she knew the harsh reality of Messmer's efforts being fruitless here in the Land of Shadows, as he would definitely suffice to what he was assigned to do in his crusade in the Land of Shadows, but he will never be returned back to the Lands Between, nor anyone else who was essentially unknowingly banished to the Land of Shadows. The thing about Rellana is that, like most Carians, Rellana's part in the story and everything is of two things mainly: of loyalty and of betrayals. After their campaign has succeeded, the troops would slowly come to realize that their goal wasn't to come back also. Or at the very least, the suspicion would definitely come into play. However, the former Carian princess, Rellana, she would definitely keep some of her most loyal followers, as we've seen quite a few of them on the way here in Castle Enzis. We see one troll, and we see one Carian knight who wields the sword of that of a troll. And we see quite a few sorcerers dedicated to the worship of the moon as its own thing of a conspectus. But many of Messmer's troops, however, in all of this crusade, they weren't truly his. They weren't very personal with him. they didn't actually know much about Messmer in general. And that is of certain faults. Of the list that truly knew Messmer was, for the most part, simply just his Fire Knights. It is described in their set that they are the only ones in all of his army that truly knew him more personally. And surely enough, their presentation would suggest enough that perhaps they themselves were quite related to him. As their arms and nets were a little bit longer than most. Their complexion was a little bit different also, but they would sport the most of his arts, the most closely to his arts, whereas many other of his men, of Messmer's men, were most likely simply assigned to him by that of Marika. But these people were more loyal to Marika, more loyal to the Erd Tree. And they were promised different things. Things that made them more ideal to be loyal to the Erd Tree. Things such as being bestowed their grace. However, as far as Marika was concerned, and as a certain set of the militiamen would suggest, the Land of Shadows was seen as the perfect place for the unwanted to be forgotten. And that was most definitely Messmer's real purpose there, besides performing his mother's crusade. Now, of course, doubters had arose in all of this. Doubters of many conditions and circumstances. People suggested that these might have been Hornsent, or maybe even prisoners, but I don't think that's the real rule here. I do believe some of these scholars are just genuinely human scholars. Like, those aren't horns, those are just like wavy hair, to my understanding. Otherwise it'd be a lot more solid. But there were certain conflictions at work and at play here. But unfortunately for them, Messmer was a bit more prepared than that. Unfortunately for these troops, Messmer brought with him a little bit of home from his home. And it was a personal bit of specialty of his own, for he had personally been in charge of the Volcano Manor at a certain point. But not only that, around that time, the Volcano Manor, back then, with the increase of doubt and that of the Golden Order, many of nobles were personally abducted and taken straight to the manor with the use of their tools of the abductor virgins. And surely enough, we would see these very contraptions brought here in a distant place as that of the Land of Shadows. And otherwise just outside of a absolute fortress bristling with all kinds of torture methods and contraptions. Enough to get to the bottom of where people heard this and that from, and especially enough of the tools to make enough of them disappear. But even more than that, little do most people realize, they come equipped with fitting executioners. Those loyal to the Erd Tree, but distraught with the unfathomable, tainted distress of those around them. Distress from a number of things, from horns that can't be cleansed. They were made initially to deal with that of omens. They tried to cure them as perfumers, as healers, but nothing would work. And so they would drink a flask, a physic flask, and it would rid of their emotions. And so they became perfect executioners to put many of omens out of their misery and enact many cruel deeds. And surely enough, around this Fort Reprimand, there is quite a few cruel deeds to be wary of. From having your hands or fingers cut off, or chopped off as it were, to sitting on chairs of nails or spikes, being stretched and pulled apart, or even just your nails removed. You think of it, they probably have done it. And you couldn't ask for a more perfect performer of the darkest deeds. And this is of a history that ties back to the Volcano Manor also, with that of the acts of the officials of the Erd Tree. They were so sworn and dedicated to Queen Marika and the Golden Order. They would abduct, torture, kill, etc. And they would see it as man's true dark nature and a necessary evil. However, moving on, to the front of Rellana was the remaining forces, scattered, dwindled, ashamed, whatever remnants still remained. Then behind Rellana was nothing short of many doubters in their order. For the Golden Order, for the Erd Tree, for Marika, and there is no shortage of doubt and traitors amongst them, as not only just the soldiers, but even Rellana's own mentor would harbor his own doubts. Count Ymir once taught and trained Rellana. He taught her in magic, he mentored her. Signs would suggest that perhaps he was, in fact, that of a preceptor like that of Celibus. And as such, he has certain spells of that of the Carian royals. For example, he has Carian Retaliation. He also has the Carian spell of extra glintstone blades. But more than that, he has Miriam's teleportation magic. That alone would point him towards to being well oriented with the royals. But here in the DLC, we are made well aware that he was Rellana's mentor specifically from his own set. However, it would appear that our dear Count Emir, the High Priest of Messmer, he would bear much of the same when it comes to the habits and history of his people, all the same. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we look carefully at how Sylvis was in the base game, he performed loyally, but he had his own ulterior motives and sense in things. He put his own interests ahead without any sense of no sense of guilt or anything in it, no sense of shame. Seeing it as an opportunity and perhaps even getting some amounts of extra truth out of it. It would appear Count Emir himself was similar in motives, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. Count Emir himself would be wizened by knowledge of the fingers. He was fascinated by the Golden Order and would worship it. He would leave Rellana as her mentor to worship the Golden Order. Whether or not this was part of what drew Rellana in to the exact following of the Golden Order, and perhaps in turn with Messmer, is to be sorted out, is up for debate. I don't think it's necessarily the case, because that could suggest that Emir was no longer part of Rellana's life at that point, but otherwise they're both here in the Land of Shadows, as if to be forgotten together. And to me it makes more sense that he would have been separated after they both have come here. But there is also certain other room of speculation as to his presence here, being of another sort of topic of general heresy. And that is the part where he fits in well with the Golden Order's ideas of the Night. Specifically of the Night Folk. Now, the Night Folk have they're relatively closely more tied with that of basically the sorcerers, and that's of Rea Lucaria, and just in general it's a sorcery than that of the actual Golden Order itself. They were more so interested in usurping it and putting in their own elements, if you would. It's one of those unusual sorts of details that's a little iffy on the language to really describe it by. But essentially, they tried to create their own order. They tried to create their own lord. They tried to create life. And in turn, that was the Albinorics. That was the Mimic Tears. And Emir himself would kind of replicate this on a more fundamental and observant level with the DLC, in which he wanted to become the new Mother of the Fingers, which is perhaps one of the most ambitious concepts yet we've seen try to be replaced in Elden Ring. And this is probably one of the most hugest concepts of ambition we've seen yet. Like, it's one thing to try to replace a lord that speaks with the gods of your people. It's another thing entirely trying to replace the voice of the orders and whatnot of your people. True to the rest of them, Ymir had his own faults, but he also had his own conniving schemes that he would have in the works. There was his Knight of Night, like for a real better term. Yolan was her name. And her sister, and presumably another one yet. However, we only know two of them by name, Yolan and Anna. But presumably the body we find, over this way is presumably another sister at the Bonnie jail. I think it was that one specifically. We would find the sister's body as a puppet, made into a puppet, at the Rabbith's Rise. And we can actually tell Yolan about this puppet, or not about the puppet, but the invasion of her sister that we see down in the basement of Messmer. She seems surprised by this information, but she's so blind-strucken with her faith in Ymir that she wouldn't possibly betray him. It is imperative to her that she must stay strong in her faith, in her belief in who can accomplish great things. However, wizened by his knowledge of the fingers and their truer nature, Ymir had developed ulterior motives. And such, he would use the sisters to his best utility of the project, in which he wanted to replace the Mother of the Fingers. He wanted to replace Metter. Overall, Ymir was nothing less than straight lying and manipulative, and especially to us. This useful obstacle destroyer who might be able to do away with this great being for him, but might be able to get swept right under the rug. Little did he know, we were too strong, we were too agile, maybe we were too powerful. Whatever it was we had, it overwhelmed him. But there is one great final factor to really discuss about him. There is no mystery that the Shadowkeep has great defenses in place here on this side of the Shadowkeep. It's drowned out with water, flooded. A ulcerated tree spirit or two runs rampant in this area. I always forget if it's one or two, but his Fire Knights, Messmer's Fire Knights, are the most potent in this general region and to the main keep. But aside that part, we see a singular, more defensible Furnace Golem in this portion along this path. And not till you go through the archives do you get any accessibility to the hinterlands, nor where the tormented shamans are that are being specially treated and taken care of. And if we take a careful look down the road from Ymir and from the keep, just past the golem, we have Bonnie Village. Why exactly any amount of troublemakers that are just down the road can't just make way here? Maybe one distracting a golem and another making way to the keep is beyond me. Can't say that's actually what stops them. If anything, the Fire Knights perhaps do. And we do know there is more than one such member of Bonnie Village, of the greater potentates there. And they've hung plenty of pots as well. Jars likely full of Marika's people being treated by their ideology. It's almost a wonder, though, if the reason that it's as personal as Messmer's personal guard, his personal, most familiar with him troops who actually know him, as opposed to knowing he's the son of Marika. We're talking the people who understand his flame, can use his flame magic, and more than definitely understand that he is the Abyssal Serpent. That they are the ones of the primary defense in this portion. That and a Furnace Golem. At the defense of Ymir, he has Yolan, and then he has basically a patrol of marionettes. I don't know what else to really call them. They're not really a platoon, they're not really an army. They just sort of wander around in circles, all around, stationed around the cathedral. But they don't really guard too tightly. So that might also add the question of, why isn't this as much at risk? And honestly, with the condition that the cathedral is actually in, which is honestly a pretty decent condition, it's quite possible. It's quite possible that Ymir himself has perhaps even swayed other soldiers against Messmer. And look at it this way. The cathedral itself, if we look around inside of it, has the seating for many. It's a wonder how many it was meant to house. What were the processions like? And this is in mind that he was a priest of the Golden Order. This is minding you the fact that he also speaks to us, kind of undermining it, telling us the roots are rotten, telling us the roots are rotten, telling us Marika is wrong, telling us that Meder is wrong, telling us we need something in the place of Meder. He himself tells us this. It's not just that the troops were having doubts, he also had doubts. But he probably had the earliest signs of doubts of all. And yet he was not of the ones punished. He knew where to keep tight-lipped, and he knew how to word things. He weaseled around us just fine. He could just weasel around others. And quite frankly, that could mean that Messmer's lower troops, less personal, could have been swayed in this sense from this portion. And this could have left this side a lot more barren from troops at the defense. And could have led this to another kind of defense. A more desperate one. A defense that was no longer with multiple platoons here that Hornsent might have suspected to be this way. With all these kinds of topics, with the fact that the Hornsent have no faith in the Golden Order, those who were once with the Golden Order also have no more faith with it, that the main defense of the hinterlands is nothing but a statue that awaits a gesture of prayer to Queen Marika. However, the means that Marika or Messmer had arrived, whatever the causes and needs Messmer and his men believed were worth backing, whatever measures were deemed necessary, as well as whom could be entrusted. There was no doubt of the suffering of the Shamans, Marika's people, butchered into pots, to adopt the flesh of others as a rebirth into sainthood. The damage of what that had dealt was so horrible that it's practically irreversible entirely, and yet there is no clear answer if that was the real driving force behind what became Messmer's crusade. Quite easily one might think it had to have been, but without understanding the timeline, a lot more becomes less clear for a turn of events, especially when we know that Messmer himself was expected to be left and forgotten here. We understand that on paper, whatever this was going on for here, nobody was expected to come back. But something else about the topic, something just as important to the Erd Tree, if you haven't noticed yet, it's right there. if you know well of the base game, what Godfrey represented the most, besides his crucible, in the wars and whatever he had been through, and represented the most as a lord to the Erd Tree and the Golden Order, you would know that he had the peculiar nature of an age tied to him. He had the age of plenty. And this is going to be most definitely a debated topic. With the age of plenty, essentially there was abundance of tree sap. Sap they could eat, sap that provided ambers. It was just, it made the tree more of a tree, and it benefited more, it provided more to its people of the Erd Tree. When the Erd Tree dried up of sap, this was a huge problem to Marika especially, because it marked the time in which blind faith would leave the denizens, those who were in worship of the Erd Tree, and ultimately the tree would become more of just a religious symbol. So you see how this becomes a particular issue, and this is most definitely part of where Messmer himself came in as a sort of problem solver for those in doubt. In which case, if Marika could solve some of her issues of what has proven her golden order to be less and less eternal, or less and less happy and perfect, if she could not solve any of these issues, her order, her people's faith, the ability to keep it all together was thin strings, thin ice. There is little to nothing left holding it together, and only great sacrifices have kept coming. Things that were once theoretically great, once really good, like Godwyn the Golden, anything that was nearing the most perfect state of it all, just kept going lost. And ultimately, it would leave long-lasting consequences in much more than just this war can suggest, but even the start of the Shattering, which also, in some way, shape, or form, the people of the Land of Shadow, the Hornsent, they've seen the Shattering of the Elden Ring as some kind of bad omen, some kind of bad sign. They didn't understand just what it meant at the time, but they assumed it was the sign of their time being up in some way, shape, or form. While it did happen in the lands between, the people here in the Land of Shadows very much felt it happen. Sort of like how we were nowhere near Mikola, and his great rune broke here, somewhere at the Shadow Keep, which we would find at the Shadow Tree base, where we fight the Shadow Tree avatar. Sorry, I'm saying this in like a different day, so I keep saying Skadu instead of Shadu. Ultimately, a land was overtaken. A people were burnt to the soul, and the Divine Tower was sealed away until we showed up. In the footsteps of Mikola, we cracked down on what his grand schemes were above his demigod counterparts, and we essentially denied him of his most peak moment of becoming, further proving the insignificance of Marika's efforts, but also thwarting someone else's who wanted to make a change of hers. Changes that would genuinely greatly impact things, although it is debatable in what kind of way. We do know Mikola as the manipulative sort, and in turn it could be of that kind of nature where you're just manipulated into this peaceful life as opposed to just living peacefully in order just being fine. Whichever the case, that is all I have for you today. And from there on, though, however, our ending and our journeys decides what we make of that for ourselves. And I'm mostly curious now of which one of those anyone else probably might choose before the others at this point. Because by this point, to some maybe that chaos looks a little more tempting than usual with what we've seen here today in this new land. And to some, maybe we just live with a fractured world, but with the Elden Ring restored. Maybe that's all we really needed, is just living up to it and letting the rest set in. Or we could just set it back in the stars with Ronnie. You know, up to you. Maybe you're married. That is a story I can't tell you. That is lore I am not qualified to hunt, because that is not my responsibility. But until next time, bye ya.